has to do with Medicaid coverage of doula services. And what we're struggling with here is section 1 that seems to create the coverage saying they shall reimburse. Before we know that we have any money that we can appropriate for a new service and before the sunrise review. And so I'm just looking at the,
Yep.
You understand what my concern is here.
Yes.
I'm not debating the value of the service, but it's, if you say we're committing to funding this in 26, we are actually committing an expenditure and making this one of our top priorities for funding over and above all the other Medicaid services that might, I don't know, could be subject of a reduction in the next governor's budget, for all I know, or reduction some other place. So if you understand what I'm concerned about is any commitment to say you shall do it, and whatever the money is, you pony it up, independent of the larger budget discussion is what we never do in here. And so that's what I'm struggling with here is to allow the sunrise review to go forward. And then, but I from a budgetary perspective, to do a to really commit an expenditure without knowing how that funding need would stack up against the myriad of other healthcare services is the concern. If it's number 1, then we'll be on the list. That's all I'm saying, Ginny. We always have done something contingent on funding.
I understand that, which is why we put in the sunrise condition as well as the date happening July 25. So
let's take a look at the language. Would that be helpful?
I think so, but you understand what my
You
concern
understand your
is.
concern is. I think Nolan will speak to that in a moment. Let's start with the language. So Jennifer Carvey, Legislative Council. So we are looking at draft 2.2.
Yeah, that's what we have, we're going to.
That's same as in the council.
That's 109, yeah, it should be. And so section 1 is the Medicaid coverage requirement. So it requires DEVA to provide reimbursement to a qualified doula for providing childbirth education and support services. Explains a little bit more about what that is. But in subsection B, it says, as used in this section, a qualified doula is a doula who is registered with or certified or licensed by the Office of Professional Regulation. So that's the piece where at least until OPR has done the sunrise review, which is what happens in section 3, there is no registration, certification, or licensure of doulas by OPR. So there's nobody qualified to get Medicaid.
Which is why you want the sunrise review.
Right. So that's the first piece to keep in mind. And section 1 would take effect on July 1st, or if a state plan amendment is necessary upon approval of the state plan amendment, whichever is later. So at minimum, you can look at this again next year and say, you know what, actually, we don't want to do it and undo Medicaid coverage before it starts.
But why don't we do it the way that we would sequence this? And that is do the sunrise review. And then that would then drive the next steps.
So I think that's policy.
It seems like we've already made a commitment to fund before we've done the necessary work. And then.
Well, the sunrise review is not, I mean, the way OPR described it, and we have to look at that language in section 3, is that OPR would, in consultation with interested stakeholders, do a sunrise review to determine the appropriate form of regulation for the profession. And this kind of deems this criteria for the sunrise review to be met. So it has the General Assembly finding it is necessary for the state to regulate doulas, really in order to determine who should be eligible for Medicaid reimbursement. And it has the report coming back by the first day of next year's legislative session about how those would be most appropriately regulated, whether that's through registration, certification, for
Well,
so you're right, it is doing 2 steps at the same time. That was the recommendation of the Committee on Health and Welfare is to figure out what the appropriate way is to identify who meets the qualifications, which is the OPR summary review
We put that
process.
we put in our usual contingent language, shall provide reimbursement contingent on.
Which the extent
Or to
appropriations
extent
may
funding.
I agree with that. I think that's the intent.
Okay, so that's what makes me nervous is that we get, I don't know what next year's gonna look like. If it's worse than this year and everybody's sitting around the room, it's gonna have different ideas about, what we can do. We have a variation on that, empty arms, that's another example almost of, well, seriously, our death doulas, I mean, so this is opening up, well, seriously, based on your part, pardon me,
I used the wrong term.
One thing we've done in the past is we've just said to Diva, like, come back with an estimate for what it would cost in your next year's budget and make a recommendation to include.
well, something like that, because I realize probably you think I'm overreacting here, but, I just don't want us to depart from our practice of really making sure that we are balancing all these competing, very worthy things. I don't mean that this isn't of benefit.
Well, it is so. I mean, it isn't for everybody.
Well, it wouldn't be for you, Bobby, that's true.
Well, no, because I'm a male, but it wouldn't even be for my wife if she was young enough to have, this is only for people on Medicaid.
Well, so is prenatal care, so,
I mean,
Let me just say that, Blue Cross Blue Shield is doing a pilot right now. And,
the next year would be fine.
they're looking to probably to do it.
so we would have a benefit of that as well. Maybe we could look at the language similar to, that they would come back with a recommendation and a cost estimate, and then whoever's sitting around the table can say, yes, we're gonna appropriate the money to add that service.
Contingent on funding in the 20.
Well, to the extent funding is available,
Funding's
yeah.
available.
So would you want to leave the language in the bill that's currently in, but with a requirement that Diva come back next year with a
Well, it seems like
recommendation
maybe,
as part of it?
maybe A is a little too prescriptive
Yeah.
for what we're outlining here.
Yeah, this-
Okay, that's what I'm
Yeah.
just trying to understand.
Yeah.
I like the language that you
Put it
use,
Bluntly,
not
Right.
contingent on to the extent that funding is available.
Well, in other words, I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
well, the cart's before the horse. First have to determine is it something you want to do.
Well, we already determined, based on the language that's for the OPR, we said, just tell us how we're gonna regulate it. It's not if, it's how, because the,
But then,
it's overwhelming,
well, if you've done that,
yeah.
then then it gets funded and something else does.
Well, no, but if it's regulated, that's one thing, but then having it be, dependent on available funding, I think that.
So I see that you're really talking about two things, because
Yeah.
if in fact insurers are talking about doing a pilot and coveraging, we really need to look at the profession broader than Medicaid. And the next question is, what would be the Medicaid cost and what funding would ultimately be made available to add this service to Medicaid. So maybe thinking of this discussion, you could maybe come back with some language that would move us forward, recognizing that this is a profession that in fact, other private insurers, based on what you're saying, Ginny,
They're gonna do it.
it's gonna do.
In other states.
And, right, which is done in many other states, and then the next step is, the Medicaid, coming back in terms of. And I guess you've sort of done it here, but a recommendation for coverage, because they might, then that would, sort of complement the analysis that would say that the provision of this service, evidence-based shows that it avoids other costs within the program. I think that's kind of what you're trying to
Very
do.
much so.
All right. If we could, understanding where we're trying to, not pre-obligate, the spending here for next year but make sure that we're moving forward in a way that, looks at this in the, as a profession and what it requires for certification or whatever. Right.
So you're suggesting an amendment?
Yeah, I am. I'm suggesting that we would kind of rejigger this a little bit and make it clear that what we're doing is, not saying that they shall provide, but that to the extent, well, they can do the study and to the extent and make a recommendation of coverage. And we also could, do that cost benefit analysis that we're really, I think, referencing in terms of what are the
cost offsets
Yeah.
for projected.
yeah, which I gathered was part of the testimony and health and welcome. Yeah, and then we can come back. We don't need to act on this today. We could, but thought it would be good to try to have some discussion and then, when you draft up something, Senator Lyons can look at it, and I can look at it and then we can see if any changes and then present it back to the committee.
Sure.
Jen, what's it, your daughter, there's a car baby who's a page.
That was my daughter.
Yeah.
Great.
Really
She
good.
had a great,
Oh,
yeah, so thank you to all of you.
so she had a great experience. Actually, I have the Vermont Life edition of when my sister was a page in 1974.
Oh, wow, that's.
Nice.
Which sister?
Kitty was.
That's cute.
God,
Yeah, no, Kitty's in here.
1970.
Yes, baby Kitty. She's very precious.
Too bad we don't have Vermont Life, we could have all the pages in
I
there.
know, too bad there's no Vermont Life.
Well, you can
Oh,
wait.
don't you
Oh,
wish you had told
Oh,
Vermont Life?
no.
got rid of it.
It worked.
Richie got rid of
Yeah.
Vermont Life.
Dirty Water Western.
Anti-magazines, anti-water, clean water.
I know.
Don't make reads anymore.
Better get
They
it
on
used
there.
to be.
He also got, yes. No, we're gonna keep going.